So picture this, October 1917. The Bolsheviks have just taken the Winter Palace. They're making these huge promises: peace, land, and bread. But what actually happened in those first crazy weeks? Was it the start of a workers' utopia? Or, the beginning of a totalitarian nightmare? That's the huge, complicated question we're digging into today. And the answer really, really depends on who you were back then.
All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the big question itself. Then we'll look at all the evidence that says, yep, this was an authoritarian state. But then we'll flip the script and look at the case for it being a moment of true liberation. And finally, we'll try to figure out how both of these things could be true at the same time. Sound good? Let's jump in. Okay, let's get right to it. So here's the question at the heart of everything we're talking about today. By the end of 1917, we're talking just a few weeks after the revolution, was the Bolshevik state already oppressive and authoritarian? Now, that is a heavy question, right? And it's definitely not a simple yes or no. So to even begin to answer it, we've got to look at the evidence, and we'll start with the arguments for yes, absolutely. And if you want to make the case that this was an authoritarian state from the get-go, you actually have to rewind the clock. Because the story doesn't really start in 1917. It starts years before, with the philosophy of one key figure. You really can't understand the Bolshevik state without getting inside Lenin's head. Way back in 1903, long before he was in power, he basically spelled it all out. His whole philosophy was that power needed to be super centralized, held by this small, tight-knit group of professional revolutionaries who were all on the same page. This wasn't about building a big tent party or finding consensus. No, this was a blueprint for tight, top-down control. And this quote right here, it pretty much says it all. Lenin didn't see revolution as this, spontaneous thing where a bunch of amateurs rise up. Not at all. For him, it was a serious project, one that needed to be managed by the pros. This whole idea that the working class needed this disciplined, guiding hand to raise them up, that's totally central to how he saw the world. And this has a name. It's called vanguard theory. Put simply, the idea is that if you leave the working class to their own devices, they might just settle for better pay or shorter hours. Small reforms. They wouldn't push for a total revolution. So they needed a vanguard, this elite, super disciplined group, which, surprise, surprise, was the Bolshevik Party, to lead the way and show them what was really possible. And you can see right away how that kind of thinking totally justifies a small group calling all the shots. And look, this wasn't just some abstract theory. They put it into action, immediately. Within weeks, boom, the decree on press. Any newspaper they decided was bourgeois, basically owned by the rich, was shut down. The official reason? To stop counter-revolutionary lies. Then you get the Cheka, a brand new secret police force whose whole job was to stamp out opposition. And even inside their own party, they had this thing called democratic centralism, which sounds nice, but it basically meant once the guys at the top made a call, that was it, debate over. If you were on the other side, this wasn't a political debate anymore. This was a one-party state being built fast and hard. Okay, so that all sounds pretty oppressive, right? But hold on, because that is only half the story. For millions and millions of regular Russians, those exact same weeks felt completely different. For them, it wasn't oppression. It was liberation, like a kind of liberation the world had literally never seen before. So let's flip this around and look at it from their point of view. Just try to imagine what this felt like. If you were a factory worker, getting an 8-hour workday and social insurance, that's not just a new rule. That changes your entire life. And what about the peasants? That was like 80% of the population. The decree on land was earth-shattering. It basically said, that land you've been working on for generations, owned by some aristocrat? It's yours now. This was a centuries-old dream coming true. To these folks, the Bolsheviks didn't look like tyrants. They looked like saviors. And it wasn't just about class either. Let's talk about women's rights. At a time when women in places like the US and Britain were still fighting just to get the vote, the Bolsheviks, basically overnight, granted them full legal equality. The right to own property, the right to equal pay, the right to file for divorce. These were absolutely radical, game-changing ideas that completely turned society on its head. And this wasn't just talk, not just words on a page. They actually appointed a woman, Alexandra Kollontai, to a high-level cabinet position. Think about that. She became the world's first female government minister, ever, anywhere. That sent a massively powerful message that they were dead serious about this new vision of equality. So what gives? How can you have this controlling, authoritarian machine on one hand and this incredible liberating movement on the other? Well, the whole key, is realizing the Bolshevik Revolution wasn't just one thing. It was a completely different reality depending on your station in life. And this chart here just spells it out perfectly. How you experienced this moment depended entirely on where you stood in the old Russia. If you were a worker, a peasant, or a woman, it felt like liberation, pure and simple. You were finally getting rights and power. But if you were part of the old guard, the rich landowners, the aristocracy, or even a rival political group, for you it was absolutely oppression. Your world was being dismantled. One group's freedom was built directly on another group's loss. So all of this brings us right back to where we started. Was the early Bolshevik state oppressive, or was it liberating? The only real answer, the only honest answer, is that it was both, at the very same time. It was an incredible force for liberation for the vast majority of people in Russia, and it was a brutal, oppressive machine for its enemies. It wasn't one or the other. It was a paradox. And if you try to simplify it, you miss the entire point of what happened. And that really leaves us with one last question to think about, for you to think about. When we look back at history, at these huge, messy, revolutionary moments, whose liberation do we focus on? And whose oppression do we maybe see as the necessary cost? The way we answer that question, well, it probably says a lot more about us and our own perspectives than it does about the past itself.